So I'm here today with Margot James, who's the Digital Minister, and I'm Nigel Huddleston, the Member of Parliament for Mid Worcestershire and the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party for Young People. And we're here to talk about the new online harms white paper, which was released this week. So Margot, can you tell me first of all, what is an online harm?
Well, an online harm varies hugely from illegal activity that takes place online, terrorist contacts, child sexual exploitation, right through to activities which may not be illegal but can be very harmful, like the exposure of young people to content that could encourage them to self-harming measures and even suicide.
Right, so those are challenges of the internet. What's the purpose of this white paper then? What's the purpose of a white paper? What's it intended to do?
Well, its intention, really, it's the last stage of a process of consultation that the government undertakes before we bring in legislation. But there's an important caveat, and that is that all of the stuff in the white paper doesn't necessarily need legislation, and it won't lead to legislation. Some of it will, some of it won't. Some of it is about education and awareness raising. We don't want to legislate unless we actually absolutely have to on any of these things.
And this is a kind of consultation then, you're asking people to respond in some way?
Yes, that's right. There's a 2-month window of consultation. We'll be delighted to hear from organisations and individuals themselves. We've worked with a lot of organisations, including charities that help protect young people online in the creation of the white paper, and we will continue to work with them during the next 2 months of consultation.
Okay, and of course young people in particular spend a lot of time online. It's part of their daily life. If some of the recommendations of this white paper are adopted and we see some changes, what will be different about people's online life in the future?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to emphasise that, you know, we spend a lot of our lives online. Everything that can be digitised will be digitised in the end. And therefore we want to make sure that people are not inhibited in their use of online services by various threats that do exist online. I think for a lot of people, they probably won't notice much difference. It depends whether they've been the victim of bullying, of harassment, of fraud, and worse still, you know, of grooming if you're very young, with the intent to exploit a child sexually. So, you know, hopefully most people haven't experienced these things and life will go on as normal. But for those who have, we will be bringing in extra protections.
Right, and for those people who have experienced some form of online harm, I think what you're envisaging in the future is mechanism and a regulatory environment that will make it easier or clearer of how that damaging content can be removed, and there's some additional responsibilities on the big tech players intended.
Yes, that's right. What we're going to do is establish an independent regulator so that government won't be making these decisions about what's right and wrong online, apart from in the very serious areas of criminality, then that's obvious. But in these other areas, it's not going to be the government, it's going to be an independent regulator, and they will be able to develop some codes of conduct which they will have the power to enforce and hold companies to account to make sure that they are actually exercising due care for their user base.
And if they don't behave, then there's some potential to fine them or make sure that they're somehow more responsible.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there's a range of enforcement measures, including steep fines. I mean, these mostly, not all, but there are many very big companies here, and I always say there is a model really with data protection, which we introduced last year to really give citizens the right over their own data, privacy and that sort of thing. And that legislation is backed up by fining powers that the Information Commissioner has of up to 4% of global turnover, or £20 million, right, if it's a smaller company. So, you know, those enforcement measures, I would imagine, will be of a similar sort of scale.
And what kind of reception have you had from the big social media companies and so on? Because don't they want to do the right thing anyway? Do we really need to get the big stick out here?
Well, we've had a good response. My Secretary of State, Jeremy Wright, and I went over to Silicon Valley 6 weeks ago. We met many of the big companies. They all recognise that some statutory independent regulation is necessary, and they quite welcome the fact that a government is really serious about doing this in a kind of considered, thoughtful, holistic way. Do we need it? That's a good question, because you're right. I think a lot of companies are taking very positive steps now, but they have tended to take those steps in response to public outcries, in response to the threat of regulation. We haven't really seen something coming from within, and that's what we want to see. And that, I'm optimistic that the companies will, become partners in this process. But I'm absolutely convinced that, self-regulation has been tried for at least 10 years. Many different codes of conduct have come in voluntarily, and they've only had a rather piecemeal and weak effect.
Right, and finally, then, there's been some criticism of the white paper already. People saying it's an attempt to kind of close down bits of the internet or stop freedom of speech. Is that the intention, or what's your response to those comments?
Well, definitely not. I mean, we are absolutely privileged to live in a country which, observes fundamental freedoms, liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of association. Those are to be treasured. And our legislation is really designed to almost enforce laws which are available to people to defend their own rights offline into the online world. Mm-hmm. There's legislation against malicious communications. There's legislations against incitement to racial hatred, stalking. All of these things have unfortunately kind of gravitated onto the online world, just as they have been prevalent for many years offline. But we need to update the legislation, so it's absolutely nothing to do with silencing criticism and people's right to free speech, not at all.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Margot James. And I think the message is, if you've got very strong opinions in this area, then please take part in the consultation.
Yes, we really want to hear from people, and we look forward to hearing your views.